Okay, I want to start with two footnotes to what we spoke about yesterday, expand on both of them, and then if you have comments or questions, we'll discuss them, and then we'll move on to another topic. We started talking yesterday about the psychology of free will. I mentioned that free will is quantitative in two ways. Number one, how many alternatives do you have? And that changes over time. You learn more. Learning more can increase or decrease your alternatives. You might learn there's another possibility that you weren't aware of. You also might learn that one of your alternatives has disastrous consequences, which just makes it out of the question. So when you learn, one of the things you learn is the differences in the alternatives that are available to you. Also, it's quantitative in the difficulty you have in carrying out the right decision. The more difficult it is, the less responsible you are for failure. And as I said yesterday, I think this agrees with our normal moral intuition, and usually the Torah agrees with our normal moral intuition. Nothing more than usually, almost always, maybe even always. Now, there's another aspect of the psychology. I don't expect you to remember this. I said something which you couldn't appreciate when I was saying it, but I was careful to qualify what I said. How is free will necessary for responsibility? I stayed away from saying you're only responsible for those actions that are produced by free will. I stayed away from saying that. What I said is any creature that has no free will at all has no responsibility. That I said. That's a global statement. The reason I didn't say it action by action, because it's strictly speaking not true. Let's take, for example, in this country, there's a very bitter advertisement, which goes like this. When you go out drinking, make sure to give your car keys to a friend. That's what friends are for. You're going to get so drunk you can't drive home. Give your keys to a friend so that you won't drive home. That's what friends are for. I say it's bitter because I don't think of it as praiseworthy or acceptable that Jewish guys go out and get drunk. Maybe I'm just naive and old-fashioned, but I think of it as a pity. Now, let's suppose he doesn't give his keys to somebody, gets drunk, gets behind the wheel, and the car crashes. And when challenged with responsibility for the crash, he says, "But look, I didn't choose to crash. It wasn't my free will that led to the crash. I was so drunk, I didn't see anything. I couldn't see anything." Are we going to let him off the hook? Surely not. Because he chose to get drunk. And even if you say he's an alcoholic, he chose not to give his keys to his friend, as the advertisement says, before he got drunk, which he certainly could have done. When you make a free decision, which results in your losing free will, and then something bad happening, we say that since it's traceable back to that original decision, the fact that when the disaster happened, you didn't have free will doesn't save you. Because it's traced back to a prior free will decision. That's why I don't want to trace responsibility to actions one-on-one with free will. You're only responsible for the actions that you performed through a free choice. That's not true. You can be responsible for actions you didn't perform through a free choice if a prior free choice led to it. Is it appropriate for an airplane pilot during a flight falling unconscious? There was an incident recently where an airline pilot was up for something like 36 hours straight before he got into the cockpit. In the middle of the flight, he just conked out. Well, there was a co-pilot, and the co-pilot took over the plane, everything else. He can't say, well, it wasn't my choice to fall asleep. I didn't do it with my free will, so I'm not responsible. You certainly are responsible. You know very well, as a pilot, you're not supposed to be up for 36 hours. That you chose to do. Now, this idea that when I choose one thing, consequences later, which in a later time aren't chosen, I still might be responsible for because of my prior choice, this category has a much broader application. Suppose I train myself in some way. I train myself to operate automatically so that when the time comes, it's just a triggered response. I don't think about it. I just do it unthinkingly. Am I responsible for it? Sure, because I trained myself to operate that way. Someone who's been trained in one of the combat disciplines. If you hit him, you're going to be dead right away. And it's not that he thinks, oh, he hit me. And I say, what shall I do? Shall I use my foot? Shall I use my arm, my head? He just lashes, and the other guy goes down. He can't claim later, well, I didn't choose it. I didn't think about it. It just happened automatically. Sure, because you trained yourself to respond that way automatically. Now, Rav Dessler, who discusses these things at great length, gives the following type of analogy. Let's suppose you go through a period of life in which you are fighting a battle, a moral battle, a spiritual battle. For example, many children steal. It's very common. And they go through a period of time in which they realize something's wrong. They feel it's not appropriate. They come to appreciate that it's wrong. But it's very hard to overcome. And they're struggling. And it may take years until they finally get control of themselves. And from then on, they don't steal. Usually, as they grow and mature, they come to a point where it doesn't tempt them anymore. They've outgrown it, as we say. And if an opportunity to steal presents itself, it's just, they don't even notice it because they're beyond that. But there was a time in which it was a real struggle. What's happening here is that through the struggle, the person is programming himself so that later he won't have to struggle. Later, on automatic pilot, he'll do the right thing. Says Rav Dessler, for the rest of his life, every time he had an opportunity to steal and didn't, he gets credit equal to the amount of effort it took to program himself into that beneficial habit. Same idea. Because it was the result of a free-willed program, the later behavior, which isn't free-willed, is something you're responsible for. And in this kind of case, it's a benefit. It can work to your detriment also. I don't know if it's so popular now, but about 20 years ago, there was a whole school of pop psychology. What's in it for number one? And number one wasn't God. It was me. Don't sell yourself short. Make sure that you're at the top of the list. You're the chief beneficiary of everything that you do. Don't be taken in by these appeals to your self-destructive sentiment that you ought to care about other people and everything else. Make sure you're getting the top billing. A kind of real aggressiveness. Now imagine a person who's brought up and has a soft side to him. He cares about other people. He feels their pain. He wants to contribute to them. He's uncomfortable with raw competition in which somebody wins and somebody loses. Now he hears this advertising and he sees this school psychology and they're telling him, wimp, get up off your knees. Act on your own behalf. Stand on your own 2 feet. And he thinks, boy, I must be second class. And he says, I'm really deficient because other people pain hurts me and I'm willing to give up for them. And he undergoes training. There were training programs to increase people's aggressiveness and decrease their sensitivity. He undergoes this training program until he becomes a tiger. Becomes a real tiger. And then he lives life with hyper-aggressivity. That person has trained himself to become bad, harmful, dangerous. So it can work either way. The bottom line is that by exercising your free will, you can train yourself to the point where you don't exercise free will anymore, but everything that was instilled by the original exercise of free will is something you're responsible for. And if it's good, you get credit. And if it's bad, you get discredit. This means that gradually you can increase the amount of your life that you are in control of and responsible for. Well, let's just say responsible for. Let's take an arbitrary figure. You start off, you're a man at the age of 13, and you're responsible for what you're doing. How much is really under your control? How much is something that you could seriously consider doing differently? You're walking past somebody in the morning, he says, good morning. Do you really have an option to walk past him silent? You wouldn't even consider doing that. Why would you do that? Do you want to insult him? He says good morning to you. So of course you say good morning. You don't even think about it. Somebody greets you, you greet him back. That's how you deal with people. That's how you operate in life. How much of your life is really under your deliberate control, where You could do it this way, you could do it that way, and you make a free choice which way to do it. A lot is not. Here's an example from a paper in the Journal of Philosophy many years ago. You're standing next to a pool, and an 18-month-old child falls into the pool. You're the only one who's standing there. If you do nothing, he will drown and die. On the other hand, all you have to do is lean down, grab his shirt, pick him up, and pull him out. Costs you nothing. What in your motivation is in favor of saving the child's life? Well, it's the saving of a life, and the parents will love you forever, and your friends will be proud of you, and you'll have the good appeal of your own conscience. There's a lot going for saving the child. Now, what is there in your psychology, your motivation against saving the child? I'm not talking hypothetically now, theoretically. I'm talking about realistically. Nothing. There's nothing. Absolutely nothing to say. But you know what? Maybe my trousers will get wet and I'll have to dry clean them. That's not going to occur to me. I'm saving a kid's life. Right? Said the author of this paper, under those conditions, you don't have free will. You only have free will when you have competing motivation. Part of your motivation says to do it this way, part of your motivation says to do it that way. Then free will can cast, as we might say, the deciding vote. But if all your motivation is on one side, you don't have free will. A certain amount of life is like that. There's just no competing, no competing motivation. You just don't do things that way. Okay, let me just finish the point and I'll take your question. Now, let me put an arbitrary figure on it. Let's say, of all the things you do in life, 30% are under the control of your free will. There's significantly competing motivation. And you make a choice. 70% is beyond. Now, that's because you have just so much psychic energy. You just have so much energy to put into this. As you train yourself to behave in certain ways, and you train yourself to behave in those ways automatically, you free up that psychic energy that was going into, that was invested in the training, and you now have it free to face other problems. And so gradually you can come into responsibility for more and more of your life. I used to say you could do it without limit to 100%. Some students point out to us a mistake, and I think it was a mistake. It's not going to go to 100%, but it can certainly increase. I had a friend who, when he was young, did a lot of bodybuilding and a lot of combat training. And when he was in an unfortunate social circumstance and somebody irritated him, he would break his arm. I mean, that's what he would do. It just came naturally. He had to work on himself not to do that. And he invested energy and training, and he finally succeeded in working on himself not to hurt other people. Now, during that period, when he's working on himself not to break other people's arms, he didn't have enough psychic energy to ask questions like this. What kind of expression is that? Is that nervousness, anger, despair, anxiety? And what shall I do to try to help this person because of his emotional suffering? He's worried about breaking the guy's arm. Only when he gets control of his overt behavior, destructive behavior, can he then say, okay, I've mastered that. What can I go on to? Let's try helping people with their psychological needs. So as you train yourself in life, you become responsible for more and more of what you do. And that's a way in which you become more morally and spiritually expressive in the life that you lead. I think that's an important aspect of free will. Your question.
I'm going to say, from the pool analogy, the guy, we're assuming that he's moral. But let's say we're talking about like a criminal or an immoral person.
Okay, see, he got that right away. That's why I said, I'm talking about you. I'm not talking about a possibility.
Oh.
There could be other possibilities. When you talk to normal people, there isn't anything in a normal person's psychology against saving the child's life. But yeah, I mean, right? There's nothing against it. Yeah.
When you're talking about the choice of free will being two opposing forces that have to
Keep going.
to frame
Yeah.
the
Okay.
inclinations,
Good.
two opposing inclinations.
You need two opposing motivations.
Do they both have to be positive, because in this situation, you would have would the opposing game be a negative feeling of weighing on your conscience that you didn't save this child, or that the parents will hate you and you will be blamed for it?
Oh no, I see what you. Oh, I was trying to figure out what you meant by positive and negative. In your use of the words positive and negative, it can be negative also, no question. That's not going to make any difference. It's just that all the motivations you have are motivations for saving the child. Let me just spell out what he's doing. I trace the motivations in favor of saving the child. He's tracing out the motivations against letting the child die, which of course then are motivations for saving him. Right. So, but and you're right. These are positives and negatives in that sense, but they won't make any difference. They're all in favor of saving the child.
Because there's no positive gain. There's no positive gain.
There's nothing in favor of letting him die. Okay, that was one point that we mentioned yesterday. The other point, which I mentioned in a particular connection, and I just said it's important, but I want to just trace out now a little bit why it's important. I talked about having an argument which sells itself as a proof that so-and-so is such and such is correct, and resisting it. Resisting it without being able to say what's wrong with the argument. Is there a piece of paper here? Okay, here's a mathematical proof that 2 equals 1. Watch. Let A equal B. They're my letters. I can do them as I please. Let A equal B. Okay? Multiply both sides by A. So this side becomes A squared. This side becomes AB. Okay? Now subtract B squared from both sides. Doing equal things to both sides of an equation. And on this side I get A squared minus B squared. This side you get AB minus B squared. Okay? Now let's factor. I don't know if you remember the difference of squares, but A plus B times A minus B is A squared minus B squared. Over here you have B times A minus B. Okay? Now cancel A minus B on both sides. Now you got A plus B equals B. Now remember, A equals B, right? So I can put in B for A. Now I got B plus B equals B. That's 2B equals B. Divide both sides by B and you get 2 equals 1. What do we do about that? What do we do about that? 2 equals 1. 1 second. Now, if you haven't seen this before, or if you've seen this before and forgotten, what's the right attitude here? The right attitude here is surely not, golly, it's a proof. Proof is a proof. Either I find what's wrong with the proof or I have to give in. A proof establishes that the conclusion is true. No, that's not the right attitude. The right attitude is 2 is not 1, period. I don't care if you give me 1,000 proofs. They've got to be wrong. Even if I can't find what's wrong. Even if you can't find what's wrong. Even if no one can find what's wrong. I'm not buying the conclusion. And I'm not required to buy the conclusion. There's a lesson here. When a person presents a proof, he pushes you into a corner. He says, look, I have a proof. Either show me what's wrong with the proof or you have to accept the conclusion. It's a proof after all. If you're rational and I give you a proof, you've got to accept it because reason says that it's true unless there's something wrong with the proof. That's invalid, illegitimate, incorrect. I don't have to accept the conclusion. The conclusion might be so outrageous that I don't trust the proof. Let me tell you, I'll keep this up here so you can look at it and you can figure out what's wrong. When you have a proof, the proof sets up a struggle between the premises of the proof on the one hand and the conclusion on the other. Premises of the conclusion are appealing, they seem to be reasonable, natural, seem to be reasonably true. The conclusion seems to be outrageously false. It's not obvious you have to buy the conclusion against your sense that it's outrageously false. What you can say is, there must be something wrong with the premises. Even if I can't find anything wrong with the premises, I can bet that there's something wrong with the premises. There's nothing illegitimate about that. Remember we talked about yesterday. We talked about Zeno. Zeno had proofs that nothing moves. What did we say the right attitude was? Of course, not to give up motion. That's dumb. Obviously things move. Zeno produced curiosities. He produced arguments that nothing moves. For 2,300 years, nobody could figure out what was wrong with his arguments. Well, there's something clever and subtle going on, and we didn't figure out what it was. No one was influenced to think that really nothing moves. And most people think that in the 19th century, when they put the continuum on a solid foundation with the theory of limits, they found a solution to it. Most people, some people don't disagree even at that. But I'm worried now about the question of keeping your philosophical balance. When I was in graduate school, we were studying something called sense data theory. All you really know is what you can see. You can only see to the next opaque surface. Beyond that, who knows? Who knows? Maybe it's there. Maybe it isn't there. That's what this theory said. For 6 months, I went around. Is there anything out there? No, is there anything beyond the wall? Who knows? Maybe there's nothing beyond the wall. I found out later that was dreadfully naive. Okay, you have a theory. So what? So what if you have a theory? If the conclusion is too outrageous, it is completely appropriate for you to say, this conclusion is so outrageous that there's got to be something wrong with the theory. I'll give you another example. Same idea of a theory. There was something called idealism. Ideas were what you experience, your own experiences, like dreams. Anything else beyond what you experience? Okay, it's a deep question and discussed and debated in philosophy. G.E. Moore, a great professor of philosophy at Cambridge University, used to say to his students, idealism? Here's how I refute it. This is a hand, and a hand is a physical object. So idealism is wrong. So of course, the students would say, Professor Moore, an idealist isn't going to accept that this is a hand. And Moore said, I know that. I understand that. But ask yourself, what do you know better? That this is a hand or that his theory is correct? What's clearer to you, more obvious to you, more certain to you? That this is a hand or his philosophical theory leading to the opposite conclusion? Obviously, you know very much better that this is a hand than you know his theory. His theory is philosophy, after all. And who knows what could be wrong with philosophy? Every century you get a new philosophy. So if you have to bet between the two of them, philosophy right and there are no hands, or there is a hand and philosophy wrong, the correct bet is that the philosophy is wrong. You don't have to give up in the face of an argument to a conclusion when you can't refute the argument. It's perfectly acceptable to say, I hear your argument, very interesting, we'll work on it, but the conclusion is stronger than the conclusion is false is stronger than the argument. If people want to argue to you that morality is relative, stop and say, excuse me, brutal child rape is wrong. I know that very well. You're giving me some theory that morality is relative? I know that child rape is wrong better than I know that your theory is correct. And therefore, I'm not accepting your theory. You have to keep your philosophical balance. Now, how you do that and when you do that is interesting, and maybe sometimes it's subtle, but don't feel cornered when somebody gives you a proof that you can't refute, you can't answer. Don't feel cornered. Because you always have the option of saying, excuse me, the conclusion is just too outrageous, and therefore I'm not going to accept the proof. Anybody know what's wrong with this? Yeah.
Can I attempt?
Sure.
By the minus, you're going to subtract, let's say A is 3 and B is 3. Then you're going to subtract 3 minus 3, 0, and there's going to be 3 minus 3 is going to be 0.
It'd be the A minus B.
Yeah, A minus B, it's going to equal to 0, and then that has to be 0 on the bottom.
Well, okay, good. You've got the right point, but you haven't identified the wrong algebraic move. What do the two lines through the A minus B mean?
Cancel them out.
What does cancel out mean?
You don't need them.
No, you don't subtract because
You're
dividing both sides by A minus B.
Oh, yeah, you can't.
And you're dividing by 0. That's the problem. As he points out, A minus B is 0. When you put the lines through, what you're doing is dividing both sides by the A minus B. You're dividing by 0. You can't divide by 0. That's undefined. That's a mistake. But my point is the philosophical point. But that's just trivial algebra. My point is the philosophical point. That if you didn't know the answer, if you didn't know what was wrong with it, you would still correctly bet that there's got to be something wrong with the proof because the conclusion is just too outrageous. Now, this is something which in all life, in all philosophy, you have to be very skeptical. When someone presents a proof to a conclusion and he pushes you in a corner and says, either show what's wrong with the proof or accept the conclusion. Of course, today, the first thing you do is Google the proof and find out what other people have said about the proof, see what they could say about what's wrong with it. But even if nobody knows what's wrong with it, like Zeno's arguments, that's no reason to buy the conclusion. The conclusion can just be too outrageous, and it's perfectly appropriate to say, I'm not buying it.